it forces us, when you're just going straight through, it forces us to deal with the text as the text, not dodge or ignore the difficult stuff. The beginning of Mark chapter 10 is all about marriage and divorce. And so all of us have been affected by that topic. Every single one of us has a story to tell, probably. Some of you are single, some of you are kids, and you're thinking, I can just tune out. This is just pointless. Why am I here? I got an answer for you. Because this church, because we take things from the gospel, there's not a different gospel for marrieds and a different gospel for singles and a different gospel for kids. It's all the same gospel. And so once you hear it, once you apply it, once you accept it, it bleeds over into every aspect of our lives, not just marriage, even though that's the primary topic of the day. Secondly, I remember many times that Deanna and I were in, before we were dating, we were just friends. We were in these singles classes, and they kept making us watch marriage videos, and we kept hating it. Until kind of got together and realized, oh, wow, that was really good stuff. Because we saved ourselves a lot just by having this backlog of information that we didn't need at the time, but by golly, it was good then. And lastly, I realize you kids, you don't have a whole lot at stake here, and I don't have a whole lot for you. So here's the deal. I'm taking a page from another pastor friend of mine, and here's the thing. You might need to borrow a pen or a paper or just start counting on your fingers or something like that. But the deal is that every time I say the word marriage, make a mark, or marry, or married, any kind of marriage kind of thing, and you just make a mark, and whoever has the closest to what I think is the right number, because you never know, I'm going to give you a treat. And you know what? I'm probably going to give everybody treats anyway. But it gives you something to do. So that's my attempt at that anyway. So
when are we starting? Because you've already got 4.
I've already had 4.
Always competing.
Right now!
Where are we starting at 0 now?
You're at 0 now. So, like I said, I realize this is a tough topic. Some of you might feel like your marriage is in a hard place right now. You might be tempted to think, oh, I am so glad that he or she is here to hear this. Or you might be here thinking, oh, I wish he or she was here to think, to hear this. But I would just encourage you to pray for eyes to see your own sinfulness and your own need. Some of you may be filled with regret, and I just want to remember that God is a God of glorious forgiveness and restoration. So for whatever reason, there might be some difficulty and some hurt. Some of you might be angry, but just take a deep breath, kind of focus, and just hear what God would say. And pray for a tender, humble, receiving heart. All of us, more than likely, have been affected directly or indirectly by divorce. We know the pain. And in light of those memories and pain, I just want to remind you, God is a gracious God. He forgives anything. And He heals anything. So just hold on to that. We're going to go into this subject with grace and with healing in a gospel-centered way. So here's how Mark chapter 10 starts. Getting up, he went from there to the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan. Crowds gathered around him again, and according to his custom, he once more began to teach them. Some Pharisees came up to Jesus, testing him, and began to question whether or not it was lawful for a man to divorce his wife. Now I want you to notice something right off the bat here. For the religious leaders, this has nothing to do with holiness, with marriage, with staying together. This, for the Pharisees, is just a test. It has nothing to do with divorce, even. Little to do with divorce. It's a test. To quote theologian Admiral Akbar, it's a trap. It is. John the Baptist took a very strong stand against divorce and remarriage and got his head lopped off for it. The Pharisees want Jesus dead, so they're hoping that Jesus will take a strong stand and then Herod will do their work for them. That's one possibility. very real possibility. But they are just looking to trap Jesus. And then note the assumption in the question and in the law. What does the question say? I got to look back at it. Whether or not it was lawful for a man to divorce a wife. The assumption in the law that they're quoting, the assumption in their question, the assumption of the culture was it's the woman's fault. And that is so demeaning. And Jesus would not stand for that. The question in the Pharisees' mind is actually, how little can she do that I can still divorce her and not feel guilty about it? The religious leaders are not in a good place. They're testing Jesus, and they're actually looking to justify their own actions. There were two different schools of thought in the religious leaders' world. There was the Hillel and the Shammai. The Hillel are the ones that had the power, and they were the ones that basically said you can divorce a woman for any reason at all. So at best, they're hoping Jesus will come to their side and give some credence to that. So that's where they are in this. And here's what Jesus says, verse 3. He answered and said to them, "What did Moses command you?" And they said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment." See, divorce was never part of the plan. It's not part of it's not part of God's design. But because sin has darkened all of us, there's an allowance given. He's not backing away from the original plan. He's just acknowledging that sin is destructive, it's divisive, it's present, and so we have to deal with it. And so they created laws actually to protect the women. That's what the divorce laws in the Old Testament are actually more about. But here's the best part of this passage. Remember, the Pharisees are after how many things might she do wrong so that I can divorce her. But look at what Jesus does. Don't just listen to his words. Remember, we're not going to approach this from a standpoint of what do I do? What do I get? Because that's the last question we ask. Look at Jesus' words. Or what Jesus does, rather. He doesn't answer their question. He answers their question with a question. That's not unusual. But listen for the question that Jesus actually answers. But from the beginning of creation, God made them, male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his mother and father, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Jesus starts by answering a question that ought to be very familiar to you by this point if you've hung around me for long enough. Jesus starts with, who is God, and what has he done in relationship to this relationship of marriage? Who is God? Do you see it? When I saw it, I got a grin on my face because this is Copernican. You know who Copernicus is? Copernicus is the guy that everybody used to believe that I get this right, that the sun revolved around the earth. Copernicus was the guy that says, no. The earth revolves around the sun. See, every time I looked at Scripture for years and years and years, I saw, what is in this for me? What do I do? How do I do this? How do I fix this? Now I see, first question, what does God do? And that's exactly what Jesus does. They ask him this question, what do we do about this situation? Can we divorce this woman in this situation? And he says, from the beginning of creation, God made these things. He takes it back to who is God and what do I do? What has he done, rather, in relation to marriage? And what does that make us? And then we're free to ask the question, what do we do with all this? So, I don't know who will ever watch this online, if we get this one online. I don't know your thoughts on the matter, but I'm just going to tell you, even what I say is still going to be controversial. You're still going to not agree. Not everyone will. But as Jesus has been for the past several weeks, he's really clear. We don't like it. We try to dodge it. We try to ignore it. We try to soften it. But he's very clear. So Jesus takes this topic way back to creation. Who is God? What has he done? He's the creator. And therefore, marriage is God's creation. It's God's idea. It's God's structure. It's God's plan. It's God's idea from start to finish. If you have a belief in God, I don't know why this is so hard to believe. I don't know why this is so hard to trust. Because I was just thinking about this. It takes God to smush two sinful people together, and they live together, and it's okay. It takes God to smush two sinful, selfish people together for a lifetime. If we were free to make up our own rules of what was right and wrong, which is what Adam and Eve did, and let's be honest, that's what we do too. That's why we want to change definitions of marriage. That's why we want to change whether or not marriage is even advisable. We want to make it up on our own instead of going back to who is God and what has he done. But if we were free to make up our own rules for what is right and wrong, marriage never would have existed. I mean, think about it. Think about it. I know, as a person of completely free will, with no obligation to God whatsoever, I know what I'm going to do. I am going to enter into a lifelong covenant relationship with the one person in the world that has the most capacity to drive me crazy. I know what I'm going to do. I am going to enter into a lifelong covenant relationship with the one person in the world who has the absolute best chance of hurting me, disappointing me, frustrating me, letting me down. Just to top it off, we're going to have a whole herd of, let's see here. We're going to have a whole herd of little tiny selfish sinful people living with us for 18 to 30 years. It's a good idea. It isn't. And yet when you say something like, well, marriage is God's idea, man, woman, for a lifetime, some people immediately go, but there's these exceptions. What if this happens? What if that happens? What if I'm not happy? Is that you making up what is right and wrong, or is that you going back to who is God and what has he done in relationship to marriage? See, if it was up to us, we wouldn't do this. We would run from that kind of challenge if it weren't hardwired into us by our Creator. Every relationship would serve only one purpose, and that is what makes me happy. And when you stop making me happy, I'm out. And that's pretty much what anybody who doesn't have an obligation to God does. That wasn't God's way. God designed us male and female, Jesus says. It was God's idea to have two genders. God looked down and created a companion. That was the plan. This is the other part about this that just kind of floors me, is that, God created Adam, then God created Eve, but it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't like God created Adam and then went, uh-oh. I missed something. He didn't do that. It was that way from the beginning. I cannot explain the gap between when Adam was created and Eve was created. I can't explain that. But God was not, it wasn't an addition because God was lonely. It was God's idea for individual image bearers of Him to join together in such a mystical union that the only way to describe it is one. And it's a picture, according to the New Testament, according to Paul rather, because we're in the New Testament, but it's a picture of God's relationship within Himself. It's a picture of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And it's a picture of God's relationship to His church, because we're the bride of Christ. It was that idea from the very beginning. So the reason we don't take our relationships back to God's plan and purposes is that it exposes how much of this I'm just making up on my own because it makes me happy in the moment. That's it. That's why when you take it back to one man, one woman, together for one lifetime. That's why everybody kind of goes, oh, but it's because we'd rather just make it up as we go along, and the primary reason being, what's in it for me? How does this make me happy? But if you acknowledge, I hate the word admit, if you acknowledge that marriage is God's creation, you have to acknowledge my marriage, my relationships don't belong to me. Somebody else created it. Paul Tripp used to be a pastor up in, I forget where, on the East Coast someplace, but he says that we should wake up every morning and say to ourselves, my marriage is God's creation. This person beside me is God's plan. Jesus goes on to remind them, a man shall leave and cleave. So there's one flesh, so unified. So once I enter into this relationship, I can no longer look at my life in an individualistic way. Husband and wife are not two individuals who happen to be living together. Not from God's side, not from God's perspective. Paul Tripp says, again, he says, I must not view my life in a meistic way. Once I enter into this covenant relationship, I no longer have the right to think me first. I no longer have the right to think, well, this doesn't make me happy as the supreme value. Now, you think it as the supreme value. Marriage is not an individual sport. We have to shift to a reistic way of life. I'm bound. It's how I must now view my decisions and my money and my free time and how I spend it and how I do things and everything about it, whether I'm with her or not. Everything I do is a statement of my commitment to this person and this marriage. It is 24/7 we. That's what marriage is. 24/7 we. I'm not free to think in an individual way. We now live as a unit. We decide as a unit. We're no longer two, but one. And then look at verse 9. What therefore God has joined together, let no man separate. It's important to me to recognize he's not repeating himself. It's not like Jesus is circling back and saying, yeah, what I'm saying is this. Before what we just talked about, Jesus is talking about marriage and institution, I am thoroughly convinced that when he hits verse 9, he's talking about individual marriages. What God has joined together, therefore, let no one separate. I believe that our marriages exist because of a sovereign plan of God. God's the one that joined you two together. God's the one that puts you in the job that you're at so that you can have the friends that you have. God's the one that puts you in the relationships, all of the relationships that you have, so that you can have influence in those relationships. But especially in marriage, God is the one that put us together. He is the one who created attraction. He's the one who worked it together. He's the one who created desire. He's the one that controlled everything that brought us together. And that's true for everybody that's married here. He's the one that did all that. I'm not going to tell the whole story, but there was a time in our relationship when we didn't even like each other. I mean, we were friends, don't get me wrong, but there was no spark. We were dating, and there was like, I don't even know why we're dating. We stayed dating because we believed God said so. And I don't remember how long of a time that was. It wasn't long. A few weeks. A few weeks, and then God created this connection. I mean, surely you've thought about this whole notion of, my mom's maiden name is Vierheilig. Very German. So my great-great-great-great-grandfather came over from Germany. Settled in the East Coast someplace. I believe it was 2 generations later that they wound up down in the Midwest. You know, my grandmother and my dad's grandmother lived blocks from each other, but never did my mom and dad meet until years later. They met at a church picnic. They got together. We moved to the city area, And that was my entire life, was in the Kansas City area. She's off, I don't remember where you were ever. She was in Missouri, she was in Kansas, she was in Iowa. After she graduates from college, she moves to Missouri. The reason she went to the church that I was going to was her dad was roommates way back in college in Arizona with our pastor. So she decided to go check out her dad's ex-roommate's church and liked it and stayed. And that's how we met. You can't make this stuff up. You ever think about that? About how many billions of things have had to come together for you to actually be husband and wife? There's a plan behind that. God's doing something. Our marriage is an expression of the glorious nature of God's sovereignty. Our invitations actually have the verse. It's ripped out of context, the preacher wants to shout. But it says, "This is the Lord's doing, it is marvelous in our eyes." It's exactly the truth. So why is that important? It's important because God knew what He was doing. He knew the mix. He knew the volatile mix that He was putting together when He had this person that was going to become Lance Armstrong Jr. and this guy who never really exercised, like, ever. This lanky, ridiculous human that has no athletic ability whatsoever. He knew what He was doing. He knew what He was doing when He put together a couple that, I could name other examples, but I won't continue to embarrass myself or her. He knew what He was doing. He did not ever, in our marriage, look down and go, "Oh man. Okay, what are we going to do about that?" He didn't do that. He knew. He knew every challenge. He knew, He knew every heartache. He knew that, I'd lose my job twice. He knew that we'd lose a daughter. He knew that, he knew. He knew everything. He's sovereign. And the minute you acknowledge that God is creator and God is sovereign, that answers the who is God and what has He done questions. When you acknowledge that God created marriage and sovereignly brought you together, you must admit that marriage is something bigger than you. It's bigger than your happiness. It's bigger than your plans. Marriage, my marriage, your relationships, all are a part of God's bigger plan. It's a part of God's redemptive plan. And like from eternity past to eternity future, your relationships in this amount of time are part of God's plan. That's so crazy. And so freeing and so wonderful and such a gift. My gosh, if you really, truly embrace that, then for example, my first boss, who nicknamed me Rambo, Jimbo's illegitimate, less fortunate, wimpy cousin, Jimbo. But he called me Rambo. He used to bounce soccer balls off my head. It was like being in the locker room all the time with this guy. That means that somehow God intended that for my strength. I don't get that. It's kind of a dumb example. But every relationship is a part of God's big plan. And if you don't see marriage as connected to that plan, you will never live marriage as God intended you to live it. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's not about my comfort. It's not about my plans. It's not about my happiness. It's not about meeting my needs. It's part of God's redemptive plan that stretches from history to history. It's fantastic. Verse 10. We'll wrap this up. In the house, the disciples began questioning Him about this again. And He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery." before we start trying to categorize people into legitimate remarriages and illegitimate remarriages, and before we start deciding whether or not this is okay for divorce and this is not okay for divorce, can we just take a step back and look at that one more time? What's the sin? Whoever divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she herself divorces her husband and marries another man, she is committing adultery. So before we start categorizing people, before we start figuring out where they belong, and before we start figuring out whether their remarriage is okay and their marriage is not, let's acknowledge that every single one of us in the room is probably guilty of adultery. Because Jesus himself said several chapters ago, if you even think of the person other than your spouse in a lustful way, you've already committed adultery. Guilty. So before we just start piling on things, let's just admit no one can say that I am absolutely 100% hitting this out of the park. Not one of us in this room can say, well, my marriage is absolutely perfect. I am selfless all the time. We are glorifying to God all the time. I wake up in the morning, I lean over, I grab the guitar, and I start singing songs to my wife. Before we have that delightful, worship as a family together where everyone behaves, and before we eat, you get it? I mean, nobody can say that. No one's nailing this. Which means, surprise, surprise, we all need Jesus. It means, surprise, surprise, that when we come into conflict, when there's things that are just kind of whatever, I have to go back to Jesus and I have to say, I don't know what to do with this woman. And then Jesus says to me, well, look at yourself first, then we'll talk about her. Isn't it annoying when Jesus, the Holy Spirit, uses the same tactics that you use on your kids? But she, no, I'm not talking about her, I'm talking about you. God, but she, no, I'm talking about you. We all need Jesus. He lived, He died, He rose again so that we would have everything we need for life and godliness, according to Peter. So we have already the grace of forgiveness. We have already the grace of enabling us to live wherever we're living in whatever situation we're living in. We have the grace of wisdom. His grace is sufficient. He knows your struggle. He knows how each of you have heard these words. He knows how each of you have heard the simple red and white truth of what Jesus just said. The hope of marriage is in His grace, which is the fantastic news that, one of the things that I try to do when I preach is to not pile you with all these, oh my gosh, this is the list of 1,000 things that I now have to do for God. And instead remind you of the 1,000 things that God has already done for you. Because when we live in that, when we recognize the grace that is constantly in us and through us and for us, we do automatically, because we're just so grateful. So think about it. Jesus is the one who wasn't just attracted to you. He loves you. He didn't see you across the crowded room and think, I kind of like her. My mom pointed to my dad in the church choir and told my grandma, I want that one. Sure. God didn't do that. Yes, God looked at you and said, I want you, but it wasn't just attraction. It wasn't just, I'll bet she or he would be really good on my team. I'll bet he or she would really make me happy. Didn't want to like that. He just loves you. And then He pursued you. And there was no playing hard to get. There was no hiding. And there was no, this is who I am right now, but I don't want you to see everything. He didn't do that. He showed you everything of who He was. And He showed you who you are. He pursued you. He's shown His love to you in countless ways. He has prepared a place for you beside Him and invites you there. He calls you his bride. He's there to meet your needs. When I was single, and I was single until I was 26, but when I was single, I remember praying and listing off the things that I wanted, right? I'd been told that you just pray about what you want and God will answer. So I just went for broke. I started listing off what I wanted. And, but I was, I don't know why, but I was listing off more character things than anything. And I still remember praying. I still remember saying something along these lines. God, I want somebody who will be with me. I want somebody that will support me. I want somebody to love me no matter what. I want somebody to be by my side, to share life with. I want somebody to forgive me when I'm wrong. I just remember listing all these kinds of things. And then I kind of stopped, and I distinctly, as any time in my life as I heard God say to me, that's what I want. And at that time, I thought, oh, man. It was just so convicting because that's what God wants. God wants me to be with him. God wants me to, to stay with him. God wants me to, and so it was this thing, right? And so, that took me on this journey and we did well. And I read the Bible a lot. And I prayed a lot and stuff like that. And I still do those things. But now I'm recognizing something different. Those are all the things he's already doing for me. God, I want somebody to be with me. I'm already with you. God, I want somebody to walk beside me. Yep, I'm there. God, I want somebody to forgive me when I'm wrong. Already done. See, he is the perfect groom. He's the perfect husband. We're the bride. And it's all his plan. Father God, I just thank you for that. I thank you for this beautiful picture that you put into people's hearts. I thank you that you led Deanna and I together. I thank you that though neither of us have gotten it right, ever, except for maybe short bursts at a time, that your grace has been sufficient. God, I just want to pray specifically as we close for anybody who ever hears this message that is just struggling. It's a hard marriage. It's what some might call a loveless marriage. I thank you that your grace is sufficient. Pray and ask that persons would not deal with everything that they're dealing with in silence. Pray that they could find someone that they trust, and that those feelings could be expressed safely in the presence of another woman or another man. Secondly, I pray and ask that your grace would just wash over them. I pray and ask that this truth of your reception of us, your pursuit of us, you being the perfect groom, I pray and ask that would be healed for somebody who's not experiencing that in physical, relational life right now. And lastly, I would just pray and ask that you would restore. Where there has been difficulty, I pray that you would make a way. Where there has been hurt, I pray and ask that you would foster forgiveness and grace. Where there has been frustration, I pray and ask that you would instill understanding. just in every way possible. And lastly, I just pray for those that are listening and they're not married yet, and the whole notion is either scary or they're just afraid that they'll never be married. Again, I pray and ask that you would remind them that you are sufficient. I pray and ask that their relationship with you would be so sweet, that the married folks in the room would be jealous of the relationship that that person has with you. And Father God, I do pray and ask that in your timing, in your sovereignty, in the glorious beauty of your plan, that you would bring these single folks together with other single folks that love you and form a union that is eternal and fits your plan